In February 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, is burning. An act of arson has shaken the nation. Seizing the moment, the government declares a state of emergency. President Hindenburg invokes Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, suspending civil liberties in the name of public safety. Most Germans, panicked by the fire and rumors of communist plots, accept these drastic measures. They think it's necessary to sacrifice to restore order. Under this emergency decree, Adolf Hitler's new government rounds up opposition figures and censors the press. Within weeks, Parliament votes to give Hitler even more power to protect the nation. The crowd applauds. They believe their leaders are saving Germany, but in truth, they have just handed Hitler the legal means to dismantle the Republic. The Weimar democracy dies not with an outright coup, but with a legal clause and public consent born of fear. The pattern we see in 1933, a frightened public, an emergency decree, and a permanent loss of freedom will repeat itself around the world for decades to come. Every time crisis strikes, government power surges. There's even a saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. History shows that wars, terrorist attacks, economic collapses, and pandemics routinely trigger sudden expansions of state authority. In the heat of an emergency, leaders claim extraordinary powers to confront the danger. Citizens, fearful and desperate for solutions, often tolerate or even demand these powers as the price of security. The American jurist Justice Robert Jackson warned about this tendency long ago. He noted that the U.S. founders knew what emergencies were, knew the pressures they engender for authoritative action, and knew, too, how they afford a ready pretext for usurpation. In other words, crises create fertile ground for ambitious leaders to grab sweeping authority in the name of saving the nation. These power surges are not gradual, they come in leaps. Economist Robert Higgs famously called this the ratchet effect. In his case study, Crisis and Leviathan, Higgs showed that the state balloons during emergencies, then recedes afterwards, but never back to its original size. It may help to picture this as a ratchet tool that only turns one way. With each crisis, government authority ratchets up to a new high, and then when the crisis passes, it settles at a level higher than before. One commentator summed it up. Government expansion isn't steady and inexorable, but rather grows through sudden quantum leaps in times of emergency. The crisis eventually subside, but many of the powers remain. So what begins as a temporary measure often normalizes into the status quo. Well, why does this happen? Fear is a powerful driver. A frightened public urges leaders to do something, anything, to eliminate the threat. Politicians seize this opportunity to push aside normal checks and balances. And in the panic, legislatures rush to rubber stamp executive requests. Courts hesitate to challenge authority. The media and public grow differential, rallying around the flag. As one analysis starkly puts it, without popular fear, no government could endure more than 24 hours. Rulers exploit it, and they cultivate it too. Authoritarians deliberately stoke fear to tighten their grip, while even democratic leaders feel empowered to take bolder actions than they could ever do in calm times. So in the moment, these actions can even be well-intentioned, but the result is the same. The scope of government authority expands, and most of it never fully shrinks back. This story of expanded power isn't just about what governments take during crises. It's about what they keep after. New agencies created, new laws passed, new precedents set. Many remain long after the emergency du jour is over. Each crisis leaves behind a residue of authority that becomes the new baseline. And this is the ratchet effect in action. It's visible across eras and societies, from ancient times when the Roman Republic appointed dictators and emergencies to the modern day. In the sections that follow, we're going to analyze how this dynamic has played out, especially from the 1970s to 2010s. In democracies and dictatorships alike, we'll visit the moments when fear and urgencies tip the balance toward authority, and explore why those temporary powers proved so hard to let go. You don't always need a foreign enemy or a war for a nation to abandon freedom. Sometimes leaders declare war on their own people, or rather, an internal enemy that they claim is tearing the nation apart. Two of the largest democracies of the 1970s experienced exactly this. This is Ferdinand Marcos. He was president of the Philippines in the 1970s, and he was facing student unrest, a communist insurgency, and separatist violence in 1972. He insisted the republic was on the brink of chaos, so on September 21st, 1972, he went on the air to announce that he had imposed nationwide martial law, citing a crisis of public order and a need to save the nation. So he assumed extraordinary powers as commander-in-chief, and overnight, democracy was effectively suspended. Marcos arrested opposition politicians. He shut down independent newspapers and radio stations, ruling by decree. He bypassed Congress and courts entirely. Many Filipinos initially accepted this. Martial law was billed as the last defense against anarchy, and the regime boasted that it reduced crime and seized illegal weapons. But behind the facade of restoring order, Marcos was entrenching himself. In 1973, he rewrote the Constitution to cement one-man rule, creating a new parliamentary system with himself in both executive and legislative roles. He never actually convened the new legislature. It existed only on paper and kept all the real power. So even when Marcos lifted martial law in 1981 for appearances, it didn't matter. By then, he had been ruling as a dictator for years. He retained sweeping emergency powers and continued crushing dissent until he was finally ousted in 1986. In hindsight, Marcos' martial law regime is a textbook case of leader manufacturing and exaggerating a crisis to destroy checks and balances, clinging to his power. He reportedly even staged fake attacks, including an assassination attempt on a cabinet official just to justify crackdowns. The damage of this was profound. Years of human rights abuses, corruption, and economic decline followed his emergency cure for the Philippines' problems. And around the same time, India, the world's largest democracy, faced its own constitutional near-death experience. In 1975, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was confronted with mass protests, strikes, and a court ruling that threatened to unseat her for electoral violations. Rather than step down, Gandhi turned to a drastic measure. She urged India's president to declare a national internal emergency, citing vaguely the threat of internal disturbance. The government proclaimed a state of emergency that would last 21 months. Overnight, civil liberties were suspended across India. The government postponed elections and jailed tens of thousands of political opponents. Anyone from opposition leaders and activists to journalists who dared criticize the regime. The press was under draconian censorship, meaning newspapers had to submit stories to censors, and critical reporting was banned. Gandhi's administration even used the crisis to push coercive social policies, most infamously a mass forced sterilization campaign in the name of population control. All of this was justified as necessary to restore order and implement tough economic reforms. But in reality, it was just a power grab, a self-coup by an elected leader to shield herself from legal and political jeopardy. At the regime's height, roughly 100,000 people were detained without trial. Under sweeping preventative detention laws, Gandhi's party altered the constitution and passed new laws to place her actions beyond any judicial review. For example, they ran through the 39th constitutional amendment, which effectively made the Prime Minister's emergency decrees immune from court challenge. With the courts muzzled, the press silenced, and opposition in jail, India's democracy had effectively paused under a legal dictatorship. It was a chilling illustration of how even a democracy with a liberal constitution can morph into an autocracy overnight, all by following legal procedures under the cloud of an emergency. Fortunately, in India's case, this story has a twist. After 21 months, Indira Gandhi, confident in her control, called for elections in 1977. But to her surprise, the voters threw her out. Democracy was resoundingly restored at the ballot box. The new government had learned from this close call and moved swiftly to amend the Constitution, limiting future emergency powers. They changed the grounds for declaring emergency from the vague internal disturbance to a stricter term, armed rebellion. This meant that no leader could easily abuse the emergency clause again, and India's brush with authoritarianism ended with a corrective. The laws were reformed to better safeguard liberty. But the fact remains that for almost 2 years, the world's biggest democracy ceased to be free, all because a leader played on internal fears. The stories of Marcos' Philippines and Gandhi's India were dramatic, but they're far from unique in that era. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, many countries saw democratic backsliding via emergency rule. Pakistan went through cycles of martial law. Chile's dictator, General Pinochet, used a post-1973 state of siege to arrest and disappear thousands of opponents. In country after country, the pattern was the same. Leaders cited grave threats to the nation. Whether communists, rebels, or general chaos, they were able to invoke emergency provisions to suspend democracy. Once their grip tightened, they had little incentive to relinquish these powers, so some emergencies practically became permanent. For instance, Egypt was under a temporary state of emergency for virtually 30 years, from 1981 all the way into 2011, which gave its rulers carte blanche to suppress dissent under the guise of security. Syria, very similarly, lived under an emergency law from 1963 until 2011. Decades of one-party rule propped up by constant extraordinary powers. And these cases underscore an ugly truth. Authoritarian-leaning governments often use emergency law as legal cover for open-ended dictatorship. As long as they can claim some crisis, real or fabricated, they can suspend citizens' rights and silence opposition indefinitely. But even established democracies are not immune to the temptations of emergency power. They may not cancel elections or dissolve legislatures outright, but they can still warp the system under crisis conditions. And to see how, we need to look at how democracies respond to a different kind of enemy, the external threat of terrorism and war. Nothing expands state power quite like war, except perhaps the shadowy threat of terrorism. When nations are attacked, even open societies will rapidly trade liberty for security. A stark example of this is the United States after 9/11. The terrorist attacks that took place on September 11, 2001, killed thousands and left Americans reeling, fearful of more attacks. The public and politicians alike clamored for action to prevent another 9/11 at any cost. The result was one of the most dramatic expansions of federal power in U.S. history. Within weeks of the attacks, Congress hastily passed the 342-page USA Patriot Act with almost no debate. The sweeping law amounted to an overnight revision of the nation's surveillance laws, vastly expanding the government's authority to spy on its own citizens. And under the Patriot Act, agencies gained broad new powers to tap phones, collect personal records, and conduct secret searches of homes and offices, all with much less judicial oversight than before. Law enforcement could now detain people, especially foreign nationals, without charges. They could track financial transactions and break down long-standing barriers between intelligence. Law enforcement agencies could now detain people, especially foreign nationals, without charges. They could track financial transactions and break down long-standing barriers between intelligence and police agencies. At the same time, the executive branch asserted sweeping extra-legal powers. President George W. Bush, as commander-in-chief, secretly authorized the warrantless wiretapping of Americans' phone calls and emails. His administration set up new military tribunals to try suspected terrorists outside of regular courts, and it detained hundreds of people, mostly Muslim and Arab men, without trial, sometimes for years. But it didn't stop there. Just 1 week after 9/11, Congress handed the president an open-ended authorization for use of military force. This is essentially a blank check to wage war on not just the plotters of 9/11, but any vaguely defined associated forces of terror. This single 60-word resolution has since been used by multiple presidents to justify military operations in at least 7 countries, far beyond what most lawmakers likely imagined at the time. In their rush to respond decisively, Congress and the courts largely abdicated their oversight roles. As one legal analyst noted, Congress actively facilitated the expansion of executive power after 9/11, and the judiciary was initially loath to second-guess security policies. The immediate effect of the post-9/11 measures was the creation of a vast new national security state. Entire new federal agencies sprang up, like the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA. The intelligence community greatly enlarged its surveillance capabilities. The NSA began bulk collecting domestic communications data, and the CIA expanded covert programs, all under secrecy. These steps were billed as temporary wartime expedients, emergency moves for extraordinary times, but most of them never went away when the urgency faded. The Patriot Act's most controversial provisions were renewed again and again and again by Congress in the years after. In fact, many of the provisions were actually made permanent. The AUMF of 2001 is still active to this day, providing legal cover for counterterrorism operations worldwide. And as of the mid-2010s, well over a decade later, the U.S. was still operating under a whole architecture of post-9/11 emergency frameworks. The NSA was still running large-scale data collection programs, only partially curtailed in 2015. And the prison at Guantanamo Bay still held detainees without trial. In short, 9/11 produced lasting changes to American law and society. Powers that were considered unthinkable on September 10, 2001, had become the new normal by 2010. Scholars would later call this a cautionary tale about how even liberal democracies can sacrifice cherished civil liberties under the pressure of fear. And once those liberties are given up, it can be exceedingly difficult to win them back. But this isn't just an American story. The same pattern is actively unfolding in Europe after terror struck. France's state of emergency after 2015 is a prime example of a democracy sliding into permanent emergency mode. In November 2015, coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris, including the Bataclan theater massacre, killed 130 people and shook France to its core. The government responded by declaring a nationwide state of emergency, a legal regime dating back to the 1950s, an effort to empower security forces. And under this new emergency, French police were given sweeping powers. They could conduct raids and searches without warrants, put people under house arrest with no trial, and ban public gatherings, all with only minimal judicial oversight. These measures were understood to be extreme, but the public and parliament overwhelmingly supported them in the aftermath of the attacks. Few dared to oppose tough action when the threat of more terror loomed. Initially meant to last only 12 days, the state of emergency was extended again and again, ultimately 5 times over 2 years. As officials insisted that the terrorist threat was ongoing, France's prime minister at one point arguing that France was still at a state of war, against a jihadist network to justify keeping extraordinary powers in place. But by late 2017, long after the immediate shock of 2015, something remarkable happened. Instead of finally lifting the state of emergency, France's government moved to write many of the emergency powers into ordinary law. In other words, what had been sold as temporary deviation became a permanent part of the legal landscape. The French Parliament overwhelmingly passed a new counterterrorism law in 2017 that converted a number of emergency police powers into permanent laws. Powers that were supposed to be exceptional, like the ability to shut down places of worship deemed extremists, or confine individuals to a limited area without trial, were now normal authorities that police and prefects can use whenever a security threat is declared. Even President Emmanuel Macron, who had initially opposed extending the emergency, ended up supporting this indefinite extension of powers under heavy public pressure. Civil liberties advocates warned that France was on a slippery slope, that these moves would trample human rights and erode the rule of law. But from their perspective, France was drifting into a permanent emergency, where the line between normal governance and crisis rule was blurred. And indeed, by institutionalizing the emergency, France showed how a democracy can normalize what was once extreme. The mindset of fear, the sense of being under siege, had in a way become baked into the French law. France's experience underscores the ratchet effect in a contemporary setting. Faced with a real threat, a democratic society accepted unprecedented measures. But those measures didn't fully go away when the threat receded. They migrated into daily governance. As one French commentator noted, it was as if the country admitted the emergency was no longer an exception. It had become the rule. The French state of emergency formally ended in 2017, but only because its key provisions had been made permanent. What remained is a France where police powers and surveillance capabilities are noticeably broader than they were before 2015. And this is the legacy of governing by fear. Once the government is ratcheted up to a higher level of authority, it's very hard to dial it back down. So far, we focused on political and security emergencies, wars, terrorism, and internal conflicts as catalysts for government expansion. But crises come in other forms too. Yet the pressure for decisive government action can be just as intense, and the consequences for government scope just as lasting. Let's look at the global financial crisis of 2008. In the fall of 2008, the world's financial system stood on the brink of collapse. One major bank after another was failing. Credit markets froze, stock markets plunged. Policymakers felt that they had no choice but to intervene in unprecedented ways to prevent a second Great Depression. In the United States, this meant that the government took control of parts of the economy on a scale not seen in generations. Congress rushed to approve a $700 billion bailout fund, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. This gave the Treasury Department a blank check to inject capital into banks and corporations. The U.S. Treasury effectively nationalized the two mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, putting them under government censorship and pledging up to $200 billion to cover their losses. The Federal Reserve invoked emergency authority to lend out hundreds of billions of dollars, including an $85 billion rescue of the insurance giant AIG. In a matter of weeks, pillars of free market capitalism were partially socialized. The government was now an owner of big banks and a guarantor of vast amounts of private debt. At the time, officials insisted that these steps were temporary, that they were just until the crisis passed. But of course, they set new precedents. Regulators and central bankers emerged from 2008 with far greater reach than before. New legislation, like the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act in the US, gave authorities permanent tools to oversee and, if necessary, control financial firms deemed too big to fail. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet swelled through quantitative easing, mass asset purchases, and never fully returned to pre-crisis levels. Trillions in emergency spending demonstrated that. When push comes to shove, governments could vastly increase debt and deficits with surprisingly little pushback. After all, don't you know we'll have a depression if we do nothing, became the unspoken argument. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis cemented the expectation that in any future economic crisis, the government and central bank would ride to the rescue as ultimate backstops. This marked a profound shift in the role of the state. What once was extraordinary, say nationalizing companies or orchestrating trillion-dollar stimulus packages, became an accepted part of the government toolkit. And indeed, in the decade after 2008, major economies repeatedly intervened in markets at the first sign of trouble, a habit of unthinkable before. The ratchet had clicked forward, and there was no going completely back. Public emergencies show a similar trade-off between individual liberties and collective safety. Historically, pandemics and epidemics have prompted governments to assert powers that would be unimaginable in normal times. Quarantining citizens, shutting businesses, surveilling the sick. We got a glimpse of this in the 21st century, even before COVID-19. For example, West Africa was hit by Ebola in 2014. The affected countries imposed drastic emergency measures to contain the virus's spread. In Liberia, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf declared a national emergency and didn't hesitate to curtail basic freedoms. The government imposed a dusk to dawn curfew, banned public gatherings, and even quarantined an entire neighborhood of the capital city. In August 2014, troops with rifles literally sealed off the West Point slum of Monrovia, barricading some 50,000 people inside their district. No one could enter, no one could leave. It was a wartime tactic applied to a health crisis, essentially locking up a whole community to stop an infection. The quarantine provoked anger and desperation inside West Point, and soon unrest broke out. In one clash, security forces opened fire on protesters. A teenager was tragically shot dead during the chaos. The incident showed the extreme tension between public health enforcement and civil rights. But from the government's perspective, such measures were necessary given Ebola's 50% fatality rate. Some protocols just weren't enough. Similar states of emergency were declared in Sierra Leone and Guinea, when authorities deployed soldiers to enforce lockdowns and even conducted house-to-house searches for infected individuals. People could be arrested simply for violating travel bans or hiding sick relatives. All of this was empowered by old public health laws that granted sweeping authority once an epidemic was officially declared. And once again, the public, terrified by a deadly disease, largely accepted the extraordinary curbs on liberty as unavoidable. Outside Africa, even countries with strong civil liberty traditions took harder lines during health scares. The 2003 SARS outbreak, for instance, led places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Toronto to impose mass quarantines. Entire apartment buildings were sealed, thousands of people were monitored or isolated, and governments rolled out aggressive contact tracing programs that track citizens' movements. These measures pushed the boundaries of privacy and freedom of movement, but in the moment, fear of a new deadly virus made them palatable. Notably, in the US, a 2009 swine flu, or H1N1 pandemic, led President Barack Obama to declare a national emergency, not to lock people up, but to let hospitals bypass certain federal regulations and speed up care. The emergency wasn't about curtailing civil liberties, but it did illustrate how even a moderate health crisis triggers a break-glass approach in governance. And of course, all of this was merely a prelude to 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic would prompt truly unprecedented government interventions worldwide. Nationwide lockdowns, travel bans, surveillance of citizens, emergency economic powers on a scale beyond anything seen in living memory. We're not going to go too deep into 2020, as most of the viewers here most likely remember it, and it kind of lies outside our 1970 to 2015 focus, but it perfectly exemplifies the theme. The key point is that when nature strikes, governments also expand. Whether the threat is a virus or a financial panic, the pattern holds. Normal constraints yield to urgency, and many of the emergency capacities, be it a beefed-up public health bureaucracy or a new economic regulatory power, tend to stick around or influence future policy long after the crisis is over. In this video, we've traveled through history and around the globe, seeing how emergencies from 1930s Germany to 2000s war on terror to health and financial crises have expanded government power. The details differ, but the storyline is strikingly consistent. In a moment of peril, extraordinary powers are given or taken to meet the peril. Some of these powers are rolled back when calmer days return, but never all of them. The state retains a new baseline of authority, a bit higher up than before, and this is the enduring ratchet effect that we identify. Crises ratchet power up, the ratchet rarely turns down all the way. Over time, this has led to what one scholar calls the normalization of the permanent emergency. In democracies, legal safeguards exist. Many emergency laws come with built-in sunset clauses or time limits meant to force a return to normal. But those emergency sunsets can be very illusionary. We saw how easily France kept renewing its emergency, and how it ultimately bypassed the sunset by just baking powers into regular law. In the United States, there's actually a law, the National Emergencies Act of 1976, intended to check indefinite emergencies by requiring periodic renewals and giving Congress a way to terminate them. Yet in practice, it hasn't stopped much. US presidents have kept some national emergencies active for years or even decades simply by renewing them annually with the stroke of a pen. Incredibly, a national emergency declared in 1979 during the Iran hostage crisis was still technically in effect till the late 2010s. And because of a Supreme Court decision, Congress's ability to overrule an emergency was neutered, meaning once the president declares an emergency, it's largely up to the president to decide when, if ever, it ends. Authoritarian regimes, of course, have no interest in ending an emergency that benefits them. They will simply redeclare it over and over, as we saw in Egypt and Syria's case. Or they'll find new ways to make emergency powers permanent by law. A common trick is to take measures initially justified by an emergency and formalize them into ordinary legislation. The United States did this with certain post-9/11 measures. For example, when courts struck down President Bush's military tribunals for terror suspects, Congress responded by passing the Military Commissions Act to reestablish those tribunals on a statutory footing. France, as we discussed, passed a law in 2017 to integrate emergency powers into its normal legal code. And by doing this, governments remove the temporary exception label from these powers. They no longer need to call a state of emergency to use them. They've just been normalized. The mission creep is complete. A power that started as a response to an extraordinary threat becomes part of everyday toolkit of governments. Not every emergency leads to dystopia, of course. Some truly do strengthen the state in positive ways or address real dangers effectively. And democratic institutions can correct course. We saw India amend its constitution to prevent another emergency. The United Kingdom, after World War II ended, repealed its wartime emergency regulation and restored normalcy. Even France eventually did terminate its formal state of emergency, albeit after embedding the powers elsewhere. In South Africa, public outrage and international pressure helped push the government to lift its long-running state of emergency in 1990. And when emergencies drag on without justification, courts or legislatures can intervene. For instance, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Youngstown Steel case, 1952, famously struck down President Truman's attempt to seize steel mills using emergency war powers, affirming that not everything can be justified by emergency. So democratic checks and balances are not totally toothless, but they're often late or weak in the face of immediate crisis. The sobering reality is that liberties lost are rarely fully regained. Each emergency leaves its imprint on the legal and political landscape. Governments, agencies created during wartime have a way of finding new peacetime missions instead of disbanding. Surveillance programs launched to catch terrorists end up used for normal law. enforcement, or intelligence beyond their original mandate. Budget increases justified by one disaster don't completely roll back, becoming the new floor for government spending. In crisis after crisis, the ratchet turns up and never quite turns back. This is why historians and watchdogs urge vigilance. The allure of safety and swift action in emergencies is powerful, and sometimes the danger is very real, necessitating strong measures. But history teaches us that we should be exceedingly cautious about what we surrender and for how long. Temporary power grabs have a habit of becoming permanent. Rights given up for one crisis might not be there when the next crisis comes, or the next opportunist politician. As the old saying goes, external vigilance is the price of liberty. And that phrase rings true whenever we consider emergency powers. In the end, emergencies will always test how much freedom we're willing to forego for a sense of security. History's verdict is clear. Governments will almost always take more power during a crisis. What matters, the million-dollar question, is whether we, the people, get those powers back. Each crisis is a turning point, a chance to reaffirm the ideals of liberty and democracy are not fair-weather values, but principles worth preserving even when the sky is falling. But if we fail to do that, we may wake up from our fear to find that the real emergency was the losses of our freedom, and that one we brought upon ourselves. Thank you for watching The Hidden Media.